So, every now and again, I get asked to do what is probably a really cool video, and up until now, I've only ever asked or been asked on TikTok. So, yeah, that's a great idea. Let's do that. Where to even begin? Let's find out. So something to keep in mind going forward through this video is that there's a mixture of me filming on my phone and there's a mixture of me talking to the camera, and a lot of that is a direct result of needing the camera to be mobile. I don't have a super long cable for this or for my microphone, so there's not really a good way for me to take you around in the room and kind of show you the things that I need to show you to kind of explain how I personally get through picking out a miniature. Like, it's one thing for me to sit here in front of the camera and explain it, but it's a whole nother thing for me to show you. Me picking a model is kind of easy because I have a very large pile of shame. You guys see it behind me in videos all the time. It's huge. I know this is a really shaky camera, but it's huge. The reality of having such a large pile of shame is basically the fact that it makes it easy for me to pick what to do. A lot of times I look for the oldest project or a project that's half finished, something that never really got taken all the way. This guy's been sitting on top of my airbrush booth for almost 4 years now, and at some point we'll do a video on how to do Death Guard. Here's another one that never got finished. For today's video, I've decided to go with a model that has been sitting in parts in my filing cabinet. It's just been sitting there. I've had it for over 1.5 years now, and rather than doing something with today's video with a project that's already been started, I went for a new one. You have to decide for yourself what you want to do with miniature painting and how far down the rabbit hole you want to go. Because there is a certain point where you're just spending money and nothing's getting done, and you have to be able to decide for yourself when to start and when to stop and what projects to work on and when. But the big one is how much time should you spend per project. I am a firm believer, Leonardo da Vinci once said that art is never finished, it's only abandoned. And I like to think of it as your miniatures never really get to the point where we're happy with them. They get to a point where we're done with them. We may not be happy with where they ended up, and you wish you could take them farther, but at a certain point, either your skill level gets in the way or time gets in the way, and you just have to be done. So that's a unfortunate reality of miniature painting, and you kind of got to keep all that in check. But with that having been said, let's move on to how I pick a miniature and then how I go about picking the paint scheme for that miniature, and let's take it from start to finish. Oh, yeah. This is just one of 2 drawers that is just full of models, some of which are 10 years older than me. Some of which are projects that were abandoned in my store that I just took home. Nobody wanted them. Models that I had the best of intentions for. I wanted to use this both for a fantasy and a Warhammer 40k Nurgle, or a Zeech army. Sorry, not Nurgle. And I have tons and tons tons of D&D models. I've even got some of those first gen pre-painted models. And that's just the tip of the iceberg with a lot of this stuff. So as you saw in the previous scene, the plastic is molded in red. I went ahead and put a mild prime on it. This is just a single coat of gray primer. You'll see in places you can still see the red showing through. I have done this to help see all the mold lines and anything that need to be removed, or even any gaps that need to be filled. You'll see here in just a second, I'll get in good and close. Right along that arm is a horrible seam mark, and on the other arm is the same thing, so we need to fix that. One thing to keep in mind with this video, this is a bad model for me to explain how to do green stuff and how to fix mold lines and how to fix gaps. I have a model already that's got some really bad gaps, but it's a larger model, so that video is coming. So unfortunately, I'm not going to really show you my process on how I fix these gaps. We're just going to go ahead and fix them and reprime them and get it ready for paint, and then we're going to move on with the video. So if you're following along at home, something to keep in mind is that your model should be kind of in the process of drying at this point. If you've had any kind of mold lines that you need to fill, then the green stuff should be drying. If you've managed to go straight to priming, then your model should be drying right now. So we have a few minutes to do something, so what are we going to do? An easy solution to figure this out is to come up with our paint scheme. And you don't necessarily have to look at your paints to come up with your paint scheme. There's a really good way that I like to come up with my paint schemes if I'm not going to be following the box art and I'm not really sure where I want to go with the miniature. There's a really excellent source for help, and that is social media. So Pinterest is a really great location. Pinterest is honestly one of my favorite places to go to come up with inspiration. In my case, we're going to be painting the Navigator model from Warhammer. So that's what I typed in, but you can type in a whole slew of things and get all kinds of really awesome stuff. This is somebody's interpretation of the Navigator. Again, someone else's interpretation of the Navigator. And again, someone else's interpretation. Now, that's not to say that any one person's interpretation is a wrong interpretation or a correct interpretation. That also includes going by the box art. However, I really love the cloak here. I think that is an absolutely beautiful touch. And I, for one, want to go for a similar idea. So, we're going to be taking inspiration from this and doing some kind of a galaxy-like theme on the back of this cloak. However, I want to blend it in with the front of the cloak, and I don't want the front of the cloak to be the same. I also don't want their outfit to be the same color either. So taking inspiration from this, we may fade into a deep purple on the edges and have a deep purple on the inside of the cloak. And we may even come over here and look at reds, because we'll be using reds in our galaxy theme, and we'll use reds for the rest of his outfit. I think this will do a really great job at bringing everything together, and this will also allow us to use a mixture of golds and silvers in the headdress piece, allowing us to go through a whole wide range of variety in color. And with that, we're on our way. Now, how do we pick out specific colors? How do I know what colors go with red and what colors go with purple? Let's talk about that. Color wheels, a wonderful, beautiful tool. And if you're not really sure where you should be starting, I recommend Google searching a color wheel. One of my favorite ones that I constantly use, I actually have a printed out copy of one very similar to this, is this one. You can see a huge range from the arguably pure colors around the outside all the way down to the faded white colors in the middle. This allows you to see complementary colors and contrasting colors, and it really lets you help to pick out the colors you're going to need. Now, when it comes to specific colors, like what color should you highlight with versus what color should you shade with, that's a bit of a different subject, but this is how we kind of come up with our mix. You can do, we'll call it asymmetrical colors, meaning you could say that I'm just going to stick to the red, pinks, purples, and blues, or even reds and pinks, or even do a study in color and say that I'm going to paint this model with 90% greens. That is something that you can definitely do. However, let's move on to how I determine what colors are used for highlights and what colors are used for shadows. So when we first start with our paint, we end up buying way more colors than we need. And the reality is that in theory, you only need one color plus black and white to end up with everything you need. Or at least for that spectrum. Now in my case, I find oftentimes that it's really nice to have a base tone, a mid-tone, and a highlight. Now a lot of people will have you start with the mid-tone and then add your base tone into the shadows and then go straight for your highlights all over, and that's one really great way to paint. Personally, I like to start with my base tone, go to my mid-tone, and then go to whatever my highlight ends up being. Now you may also want to have specific skin tones. Like an example, the one on the top is actually Demonette Hide, which is a really nice bright purple, and it's got a lot of skin tones in its base tone. And I just have that because anytime I want to do purple skin tones, it's a really great color for that. When it comes to my blue collection, it's a really good example of kind of going overboard with different colors of paint. But I had different projects, everything from the dark end of the spectrum all the way through to the mid-range and the high range, where it's almost pure white. And yeah, there's a little bit of purple in there, but it's still in the blue spectrum as far as I'm concerned. Now, this is an interesting predicament because when I go to paint blues for a miniature, this gives me a really good way of practicing my rule of thirds, whereas I go from my dark tone straight to my mid-tone, so the one I'm pointing at now versus the ones in the top of my hand, and then my high tone all the way in the bottom is going to be my highlight color. But if I really want to go with a super slow gradient, going all the way from that darkest tone all the way to that highest tone on a piece of fabric, I'm really able to nail this one home on this one instead of just struggling with a wet palette to kind of get that perfect blend across all my colors. Whereas if a lot of you maybe are still using a dry palette, it's going to be a little more difficult to get that array of colors, and you're going to have to do a lot of wet blending on the model. So there's a positive side of having tons of color and a negative side of having tons of color. But in my case, I start with the dark Cantor blue, that bottom left-hand original color, and I go to a mid-tone which was in the middle of my hands, and then to the high tone in the bottom right-hand corner of what you had seen originally. So the three colors you're seeing on screen are the three I used. I didn't use more than this. If you see a blend of colors on the model, it's a direct result of me mixing these three colors. Going forward on this model, when you see the final version of this model, I have only used three types of colors, or three tonations of colors per color used on the model. So if I've used red, I've only used three different types of red. If I've used blue, I've only used three different types of blue. If I've used purple, I've only used three different types. And the reason I've done this is to show you that you can paint an absolutely beautiful model using just three versions of each color, to prove to you that you do not need to go over the top with buying tons of paint when you first get started. So here we can see the three tones of red that we're going to be using for the inner outfit, that internal cloak. We're using that dark red, we're using our mid-tone, and we're using almost a bright orange. In this case, it's a Corn, Mephiston, and then Jericho orange. Now here I've just laid in my base tones. This is to get things ready for me. So I've laid in my base tone of red, my Corn red, and then I'm going into my Mephiston red, and this is going to be our first layer of highlights. So when applying this first layer of red, we want to stick to anywhere that is exposed to the sunlight. So this is our mid-tone, and we're going to be putting this on all of our raised surfaces, but we're staying away from the bottom, the part that would be in shadow. Tip the model towards you to get a better idea of where those shadows and where your highlights should end up. Essentially, when looking from top down, what you can see is where your highlights should end up. Once you start getting a better understanding of how light works and how your models work with light, you can start really cherry picking where the light ends up, meaning specifically that you can make it look as though the sun is directly behind the miniature or in front of the miniature or to one of the sides of the miniature. But for now, when you're just learning and you're just getting started, just pretend as though the sun is directly above the miniature, and like I'm doing now, looking straight down the line of the miniature, only paint the areas that you can see. Now moving on with our Jericho orange, you can see I'm going to be mixing our mid-tone and some of our highlight tones. So I'm mixing in the Mephiston red with the Jericho orange. and this is giving me a mid-grade between the two. And the reason for doing this is I want to do another all-over highlight. Because this is fabric, I want to have that nice blend of colors between our deepest tones and our brightest tones. So I'm basically doing a pass of this mid-tone between our previous mid-tone and our current highlight. I'm focusing that mostly on just the extreme raised edges, and then I'm only taking the pure Jericho orange and applying it to the absolute most extreme edges. Now I feel the need to apologize. As you can see, we've cut forward quite a bit to the point that the model is done. Today's video was more or less just about teaching you guys how I go about picking my colors and how I come up with my paint scheme. So this wasn't really meant to be a tutorial, which is why there's only as little of a tutorial as what you guys have gotten. This isn't meant to be a jab at those of you who are wanting to learn how to paint like this. This was meant to be more or less just a this is how I do it type video. I am planning to do a galaxy type paint job on a model in the future for Age of Sigmar. You guys saw at the beginning of the video I have a Lord of Change. I really want to do a galaxy like paint job in the wings of the Lord of Change, as if to show the illusions that he tends to conjure and that his wings are faded out into this open galaxy. I think that would make a really beautiful paint job. However, I have a little ways to go before we get around to that project, so this is more or less meant to have been a test model for how I am going to do that, and I thought this would be an excellent model to teach you guys the basics of how I come up with a paint scheme and how I choose my colors and how I go about choosing a model and deciding what we're gonna do for a video. So there you go, guys. This is more of a how-to than it was a tutorial, like I've been saying. Hopefully you guys understand that, and that this is a how to get started, not a how to paint. So I've had a few questions before in the past about how on earth you can get started in miniature painting. Once you get started, this is your next step. How to pick what you're going to do, how to pick your color scheme, and what to do about a color scheme if you just have no idea. I've had several people reach out to me saying that their imagination isn't as good as it was when they were a child. I don't think it is for any of us, but this is a really great way if you get blocked what you can do and how to come up with your colors. So hopefully this is enough to get you guys started and to get you guys going on your hobby game. Hopefully you guys learned something and you can take your things to the next level. And as always, I hope your display case is always full and your pile of shame never runs empty. Until next time, guys. Bye.